Hey everyone, tonight we're going to start with the amazing life and amazing fortitude of medieval peasants. The common people who persevered through some of the coldest and cruelest nights in history in spite of the odds. From improvised insulating techniques to group sleeping arrangements, their tale is one of perseverance, resourcefulness, and resolve. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. Additionally, tell me in the comments what time it is for you and where you are tuning in from. Seeing who is joining us from around the globe is always exciting. Now turn down the lights and, if you like that gentle background hum, turn on a fan. And let's take it slow as we embark on our journey tonight. Medieval life may conjure images of joyous fairs, lavish feasts, and jousting nights. For the typical peasant, however, winter was more about avoiding death than it was about celebrating. The season wasn't all that. Like a particularly tough teacher who didn't believe in second chances, it was an annual test of endurance. Imagine this. The walls of your small stick and mud home are so thin that you could probably hear a bird sneeze outside. No windows unless you include a tiny hole filled with animal hide. No insulation, and most definitely no arguments with your siblings over the thermostat. Your home's inside temperature was typically only a few degrees warmer than the outdoor temperature, and it was courteously a little less freezing inside if it was freezing outside. Well done. The toughest times were at night. Everything was engulfed in darkness. The fire on the hearth burned pitifully, trying its best, but primarily just burning the toes of whoever was seated closest, while the wind howled like a vengeful ghost. I apologize. You might as well have been camped outside with inferior snacks if you were on the opposite side of the room. Clothes also didn't help much. Peasants lacked blankets made of goose down and expensive fur coats. A pair of rough-spun wool tunics were yours. Perhaps a cloak with a suspicious goat scent and the expectation that you would become a human onion by layering them. It didn't actually work, to give you a hint. And don't think about curling up behind cozy quilts. Often, beds were only bags filled with straw or hay, possibly with a few old rushes for good measure and, as an added bonus, some fleas for companionship. Luxury is the medieval peasant way of life. In addition to being uncomfortable, the cold was harmful, particularly for young children and the elderly. The risks of frostbite, hypothermia, and general freezing to death were ever present. If you woke up each morning still breathing, it was a small miracle that was truly worth celebrating, perhaps with a little less frozen turnip for breakfast. So, obviously, comfort was not the key to surviving a medieval winter. It was about huddling with your livestock, gritting your teeth, putting on as much clothing as you could, and hoping that you didn't wake up with icicles hanging from your eyebrows. And the true journey was only getting started. Medieval peasants would like to know whether you believe that your flat is drafty due to a window that doesn't close all the way. Not only were their houses drafty. In essence, these were roofed wind tunnels with a lot of enthusiasm. Historians gently refer to the majority of peasant homes as WL and daub construction. Translation: sticks coated in a wonderful concoction of mud, straw, and animal excrement, crisscrossing like a huge basket. Dull, really. They had no intention of being repulsive. Dung was a sticky, inexpensive insulator. Furthermore, let's pretend that it was always easily accessible. Despite their affectionate coating, these walls were not very resilient to a real winter storm. In order to ensure that you never became overly comfortable, the chilly wind happily danced its way inside the one-room houses, finding every crevice and opening. No privacy at all. Not exactly warmth. Character development, of course. There were the roofs after that. After a few months of rain and snow, thatched roofs sagged, leaked, and occasionally allowed in the local fauna, despite their lovely appearance. There's nothing like a squirrel pooping on your supper to make for a great evening. If there were windows at all, they were ridiculously small and typically had wooden shutters or thin animal hides covering them. Even the lord of the manor probably couldn't afford more than a single little pane, and peasants because glass was so costly. If the wind didn't tear the cowhide off the wall in the middle of a blizzard, they were content. Even worse, floors were frequently little more than compacted dirt. You could say that they had indoor water features since muck seeped up through the earth when it rained or snowed a lot. They didn't seem to like it. Every step you take inside your own house during the winter may feel like you're walking through a frozen swamp. It's chilly inside, cold outside, and freezing above. It was an attack on your body heat in 3 dimensions. Peasants in the Middle Ages, however, were not the kind to complain. They cuddled close to one another, pushed old rags into the worst drafts, and filled in crevices with moss. Insulation by humans at its best. Often, the only things preventing them from becoming medieval popsicles were ingenuity, obstinacy, and a little sheep grease applied to the walls. Because at least you could make fun of it if your house was falling apart, and the only way you could shelter yourself from the weather was with mud and goat hair. If your teeth weren't chattering too much. Sort of. In addition to the frigid temperatures, medieval peasants had to contend with a silent foe that rose from below, the actual frozen earth. Back then, floors weren't actually floors. They were merely bits of earth within your house that were a little flatter. Perhaps, if you were fortunate, someone had thrown some old rushes or straw down to make you feel better. Don't be misled, though. You were sleeping one insult away from the harsh, cold soil. Oh, how unrelenting that cold was. Like a malevolent little ghost, it wormed its way up from the dirt, through the straw, into your bones, and directly into your soul. Congratulations if you dropped anything on the ground on a wintry night. Now it was a permafrost feature. Peasants in the Middle Ages made several attempts to combat this bleak struggle. If you could afford it, one way was to spread thick mats of straw over the floor. More practically, you might have a good insulating barrier if you could steal enough of it from your neighbor's field without being discovered. However, straw quickly became flattened, became moldy even more quickly, and gave your already dreary nights a crunchy soundtrack. Instead, some houses covered the earth with layers of dried rushes. They occasionally threw new rushes on top of the old ones without clearing them away. This eventually produced an intriguing ecosystem of fleas, decaying plants, and whatever otherworldly species chose to settle there. In essence, it was padding for medieval carpets. If your carpet smelt like a wet dog, was alive, and was just a little bit damp. For those who owned them, beds didn't address many problems. Typically, they were merely wooden frames filled with more straw or hay. You guessed it. You had brittle, shifting, and protruding layers in place of comfortable beds, which did little to stop the cold that was coming from below. Comfort was not the reason for tossing and turning. Maintaining blood flow and preventing one side of the body from freezing required an awkward and desperate dance. In actuality, medieval peasants learnt to live uncomfortable above the freezing ground rather than conquering it. Dreams and smoothness had nothing to do with a good night's sleep. It has to do with waking up with every toe still in place. And you were doing better than most if you were able to accomplish that. If there was one winter hero in medieval homes, it wasn't the walls, the roof, or even the valiant insulation made of dung and dirt. The only true protection against the cold, the darkness, and the overall gloom of medieval existence was the hearth, a strong, crackling fire pit. Almost every peasant house had a basic fire in the middle. No elegant stone mantel over the fireplace, no tidy chimney blowing smoke into the air. You had a simple pit or pile of stones instead, some partially burned logs, and enough smoke filling the room to make you question whether you were slowly turning into a gammon. Yes, exactly. The majority of houses lacked chimneys altogether. Smoke did its best, sort of. If it was feeling lazy that night, it drifted out via tiny holes in the roof, crevices in the walls, or straight into your lungs. It wasn't good for your life or for breathing. Positively, though it was excellent in fumigating fleas and other undesirable visitors. When you're marinating in smoke 247, who needs pest control? Nor was the hearth solely for warmth. It served as the kitchen, a source of light, and occasionally even a television in the Middle Ages. Since there wasn't much else to do after sunset, people would sit around the fire and tell stories, gossip, or simply gaze into the flames. It wasn't merely a good idea to keep the fire going. It was required. It was like sending a signal to the cold to come in and kill you if you let the fire go out at night. And it wasn't as simple as lighting a match to rekindle a fire in the winter. You had to use more prayers than you had ever prayed before, along with flint, steel, and kindling. Every member of the household had a responsibility. Adding sticks, peat, embers, and, if you were lucky, a priceless piece of dry wood, as well as keeping an eye on the flames. It was a never-ending struggle between human tenacity and the oppressive cold that just wished to kill you. Although survival was not assured by the hearth, it was unthinkable without it. The small fire was smoky, spitting, and frequently disappointing. But it was the lifeblood of hope during a medieval winter. Letting the fire go out overnight was the one thing medieval peasants dreaded more than running out of ale. The winter would arrive more quickly than a tax collector after harvest if there wasn't that warm, flashing lifeline. Furthermore, building a fire from scratch in the thick of winter wasn't simply inconvenient. It might be fatal. There were no matches yet. Lighters continued to dream. If you wanted to rekindle a fire, you had to strike steel and flint together, pray for one precious spark, and then nurture that light with love and whatever dry kindling you hadn't burned days earlier. Imagine attempting to accomplish all of this while half asleep and with cold fingers in the icy darkness. Now, for added motivation, imagine a wolf roaring in the distance, hungry. So peasants became intelligent. The fire was banked. Not in a comfortable savings account, please. Just before bed, banking entailed gently burying the embers behind a pile of ash. By acting as a covering, the ash protected the blazing coals and kept them alive till dawn. If it were done correctly, you could walk over at dawn, rummage around in the pile a bit, add some new wood, and presto, fire without the frostbite. Let's just say that mornings became much colder and much grumpier if you did it incorrectly. Like a treasured family recipe, fire banking was an art form that was passed down from parent to kid. Everybody has small secrets of their own. Some advised using only dry ash. Others said that a little moisture was essential. Some tightly packed the embers. Others gave them room to breathe. Just by proposing an improved fire banking technique, you may essentially start a medieval debate. With somewhat greater implications for existence, it was the archaic equivalent of debating BBQ techniques. Sometimes it wasn't enough to just bank the fire. In any case, a howling wind may snuff it out by slipping through a crevice, or a sheep that is clumsy might fall into the fireplace. It did indeed occur. Some families took turns waking up in the middle of the night to check the coals because of this. It's essentially the thermostat's medieval equivalent of sleepwalking. Ultimately, fire banking was more about purchasing a few more valuable hours of warmth than it was about controlling nature. And that alone was your victory if you awoke to even one ember still alive, and enough to battle the cold for another day. The adage, the more the merrier, wasn't limited to celebrations in the Middle Ages. It was a strategy for surviving the winter. There was one reliable source of warmth when the fire flickered and the icy winds blew through all the crevices. One another. And if that meant sharing a bed with your whole family, your neighbors, your animals, and maybe a very perplexed goose, then so be it. Personal space is irrelevant. There was no such thing as privacy. Comfort was not the aim on the coldest evenings. Don't wake up frozen to the ground, was the message. In what may be called a frantic, snoring human lasagna, entire households gathered into the warmest area of the house, covered in whatever shreds of cloth they could find. Grandparents nestled beneath the upper blankets, younger children crammed themselves between parents, and if Cousin Ethel happened to turn up out of the blue, well, there was always space for another. Body heat emanated from all sides. So if you were lucky, you were able to sleep in the center. You were on the brink, the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to a meat locker door if you were unlucky. And to the one who moved excessively throughout the night, woe be to them. You make one adjustment to settle in, and all of a sudden, you've knocked Aunt Maud into the icy wall draft. You're the family villain now. Congratulations. Even the bedding was shared at times. A shared straw mattress that gradually became flattened from the weight of several generations' nightly use. Let's just say it wasn't the most fragrant sleeping arrangement because, at the time, hygiene wasn't exactly receiving any accolades. Hey, you stop being fussy when it's you against frostbite. Body heat served a purpose, in addition to being pleasant. As human shields against the cold, some medieval instructions even suggested placing the group's strongest and warmest members on the outside. Deep in the center, snuggled up like the priceless tiny heat generators they were babies and fragile elderly people. But this was more than a matter of survival. It eventually became ingrained in everyday life and a means of strengthening family ties. Muffled under a shared wool blanket, long cold nights spent huddled together resulted in storytelling, singing, and surely some very intriguing conversations. Remember that at least you're not battling for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a particularly critical goat the next time your sister takes your blanket or your dog hogs the bed. Medieval peasants would want to introduce you to their winter housemates if you found contemporary roommates difficult. Animals having a pulse and some body heat, such as cows, goats, pigs, and chickens. It was more than just a peculiar rural custom to bring animals within. It was essential to survival. Warmth was produced by livestock, and every degree mattered in a fell with little insulation where the wind howled louder than your stomach. Additionally, your goat was somewhat less likely to be stolen by a neighbor in the middle of the night if it shared a wall with you. One foul-smelling stone, two birds. The house turned into a chaotic living furnace at night. Cows lounged lazily against the walls, chewing cud like they paid rent. Pigs snorted beside the hearth, and chickens slept in corners. It wasn't glitzy. Not at all. Imagine being stranded in a car with someone who neglected to take a shower during a summer road trip. It's a cow, though. Winter is here. Furthermore, there isn't really anywhere else to go. It has a famous scent. By spring, there was something ferocious about the scent of a shared winter. A candle didn't need to be lit. Already, your nose were experiencing a tremendous roller coaster. However, a selective nose was created by medieval peasants. They were aware of one unsettling fact, therefore they didn't moan much. There will be fewer freezing toes in the morning if there are more animals inside. There were even great sights for certain species. Near the family, cows typically took the stage because they were the largest and warmest. In order to keep warm, goats were let to come closer. Furthermore, goats would invariably find a way inside since they are goats. Pigs didn't care that chickens kept their eggs in old baskets or rafters. They settled down anywhere they wanted, most likely in the center of the floor. There were risks associated with sleeping with livestock, of course. Imagine going to sleep soundly only to be forcibly woken up in the morning by a fowl that decides your hair makes an excellent perch, or by going barefoot into something suspicious. Indeed, there could be a lot of surprises on a medieval morning. Even so, peasants comprehended the basic maths, despite the commotion, the odors, and the occasional hoof to the ribs. Cows cuddle whether they want to or not, and cold kills. A warm, slightly slobbery cow breath was often the difference between life and death in the struggle against the cold fingers of winter. Fashion in the winters of the Middle Ages was not about appearances. It was about avoiding death. Peasants weren't perusing the newest fashions. They were dressing as though they were getting ready to fight the Grim Reaper himself. It was an easy rule. You wore it if you owned it. Occasionally, simultaneously. The first is the simple undertunic, which is a scratchy linen shirt that is most likely not very clean. A heavier woolen tunic above that. Then another, if you had one, with a rough cloak over your shoulders, leggings that sagged at the knees, and, if you were extremely fortunate, a patched-up sheepskin put on top like a trophy. Well done. You're 90% itchier and about 10% warmer currently. Boots were an extravagance. Many peasants placed their feet into wooden clogs after wrapping them in layers of fabric or old rags. You simply added another rag and hoped you didn't lose a toe if the cold still bit through. Also, don't bother cleaning all these layers. You had to bring your clothing to a frozen creek, smash through the ice, and wait 2 days for your one and only shirt to dry in order to wash them in the dead of winter. The majority of peasants rightly concluded that smelling like a mixture of smoke, sweat, and sheep was a modest price to pay for not freezing solid if it didn't simply freeze into a catastrophic shirt cycle. It's interesting to note that the accumulation of oil and grime has an added benefit: insulation. Body heat was trapped in that dirty layer. It was similar to a Gore-Tex jacket from the Middle Ages, but it smelt worse and was far less socially acceptable now. Gloves, scarves, and hats were valuable items. The difference between surviving the night and waking up with your hair stuck to the wall could be as easy as a woolen cap. Gloves were frequently created by hand, using whatever leather or fabric remnants someone could find, occasionally appearing more like depressing puppet costumes than anything stylish. Children in particular were swaddled till they waddled around the house looking like overstuffed turnips. The objective was to retain as much of the valuable body heat as possible. I've never heard of style or elegance. The true medieval flex was warmth. The next time you gripe about wearing layers on a cold day, keep in mind that medieval peasants, who looked like lumpy laundry sacks and considered themselves fortunate, wore half of their clothing at once. Dirt wasn't something that could be cleaned off, according to the medieval peasant playbook. It was essentially a tool for survival. Getting dirty wasn't an indication that you had given up on life, as it turned out. It was strategic, tactical, and, dare we say it, brilliant. You see, winter presented a very particular challenge: loss of heat. Surprisingly, clean clothing, especially freshly laundered linen, did not keep you warm. Yes, they were breathable, but that wasn't exactly a selling point when the temperature was in the range of hypothermia, to immediate regret. Dirt entered the picture. Layers of dirt, natural body oils, and good old-fashioned muck started to accumulate on the tunics, cloaks, and leggings of peasants as they trekked through day after day without washing their clothes. Clothing became more windproof as a result of this. Natural armor gradually filling in the little holes in the fabric. It smelt like weatherproofing from the Middle Ages. You did smell like a goat that had lost a wager, but you know what? You were warm. Some medieval people truly thought that washing too much during the winter could cause illness. It is preferable to preserve that barrier of sacred defilement. Laundry and bathing were uncommon, and soap, when it was available, was only used for important events like the bishop's visit or perhaps just before you passed away. Peasants layered their garments without altering the ones underneath, which furthered the tactic. You just added your fresh layer on top of the one from the previous month. You eventually turned into a walking museum of the previous 6 weeks. Each stain narrates the valiant tale of how I slipped in the mud and survived. Medieval peasants may have appeared and smelt to outside onlookers as though they had completely abandoned personal cleanliness, but they were aware of this. That crusty, dirty tunic served as a thermal barrier to prevent frostbite death. Although it wasn't glamorous, freezing to death because you wanted to smell like flowers wasn't either. Furthermore, you weren't bothering anyone in a world where everyone practically smelt like perfection. Being nose-blind was essentially a lifestyle choice. Therefore, filth was not a failure throughout the medieval winters. It was style. It served a purpose. And by February, my friend, you were winning at life if you had a thick, oily upper layer. Don't believe that medieval peasants huddled together in embroidered comforters and luxurious feather mattresses throughout the cold. It was a little more rustic in actuality. And when I say rustic, I mean to sleep on a heap of dead plants and cross our fingers. If you could afford it, a basic wooden frame bed covered with a large sack filled with hay, straw, or old rushes was the norm for medieval peasants. That's all. No orthopedic support, no memory foam, and no five-star hotel stay. Just a lumpy, crunchy, slightly prickly mess with a subtle barnyard and regret scent. A pleasant soundtrack of crinkling straw and the occasional sharp stab from a stray stalk accompanied every toss and turn in the night. In order to create a sumptuous groundal sleeping experience that contemporary influencers would likely rename as earth-connected slumber, some peasants even completely eschewed the wooden frame and tossed the straw directly into the dirt floor. Not only were the straw mattresses uncomfortable, they lasted only a short time. The straw eventually became a biological danger area as it flattened, developed mold, and attracted insects. Usually done a few times a year if you were careful, or any time your bed began actively moving without your consent. Changing the straw was a significant event. Rushes were a common substitute. In order to cover up the overpowering smell of cattle from everyday life, these long grasses were laid thickly on the floor and occasionally combined with herbs like lavender or rosemary. For a day or so, fresh rushes smelt wonderful. Then they blended in with the dirt, food crumbs, and whatever else drifted in, becoming part of the muddy, trampled terrain within the house. Not to mention the bedfellows. Straw bedding was as popular with fleas, lice, and other lovable creatures as it was with the peasants. Congratulations if you woke up scratching more than you slept. You were experiencing the real thing in the Middle Ages. These modest beds saved lives in spite of the difficulties. A vital layer of insulation against the freezing ground was offered by piles of straw. Additionally, clustering together on top of them produced shared body heat pockets, the best of medieval central heating. If you live in a house made of sticks, mud, and hope, you soon discover that winter breezes are more than just an annoyance. So the next time you settle into your cozy, supportive mattress, remember that somewhere in the past, a medieval peasant is looking down at you, smiling through a mouthful of missing teeth and saying, "Must be nice." They are insults to the person. Peasants in the Middle Ages did more than simply fend off the cold. Armed only with whatever they could jam into the crevices, they battled it from within their own houses. And there were many cracks, I assure you. Thatch sagged, mud collapsed, and walls bent. The cold, like a vengeful poltergeist, appeared to find new areas to creep in each night. The act of sealing the house turned to become a kind of art. Moss, straw, discarded clothing, bundles of dry grass, and occasionally even animal hair were used by peasants to fill up gaps. It was shoved into a hole somewhere if it was mushy, soft, or strangely insulating. As a yearly winter endeavor, some very tenacious individuals covered the exterior of their walls with additional layers of manure and mud. Imagine putting cold manure into your own house in frigid weather and thinking, "This is fine, this is luxury." Because, in a sense, it was. Another battleground was leaks in the roof. Although thatch was inexpensive and widely available, it wasn't completely waterproof, particularly after a few rainy and snowy seasons. In times of extreme need, peasants would use pieces of turf stolen from the closest field, bundles of hay or spare pieces of cloth to patch holes in the roof. Eventually, every house began to resemble a patchwork quilt, a little depressing, created by someone who quit up in the middle. Windows and doors. You were fortunate if you had them. Even yet, they were merely planks of wood held up by iron nails and obstinacy. In order to keep out the worst drafts and give the living area an additional scent of mystery meat, window apertures were sometimes patched with animal hides or thick linen saturated in animal fat. Every night was a struggle between the persistent, cunning cold and human resourcefulness. A sudden gust would discover The one spot you missed and slap you awake like a chilly hand of doom, while the next minute you were warm. But somehow, one muddy handful at a time, medieval peasants patched, stuffed, and muddled their way through the harshest winters nature could throw at them by a cunning, stubbornness, and an unwillingness to accept being somewhat frozen as a permanent condition of existence. Medieval peasants had a remedy for nights when the cold was severe enough to keep you up. Don't even attempt to act as though everyone is asleep at the same time. Rather, they devised a survival tactic, sleeping in shifts that would today make any military leader pleased. It wasn't some elaborately planned system complete with roll calls and whistles. It was a lot more desperate and more simpler. The other half of the household nestled up under hay and threadbare blankets, attempting to get a few precious hours of half-frozen sleep, while the other half stayed up, tending to the fire and repairing errant drafts. The fire required continuous care. If left unchecked, it would subside, and remember, it was as easy as persuading a sulky donkey to dance to start over. Someone must have been on Ember Patrol then. Families also switched shifts since, once they were at last warm, nobody wanted to get up. Trying not to tread on a goat, you slept for a few hours, were nudged awake, and then staggered over to the hearth to prod, poke, and cuss the fire back to life. It was not a glamorous rotation. There were no late-night snacks, no night vision goggles, and most definitely no snooze buttons for 5 more minutes. Only heavy eyelids, stiff joints, and an increasing bitterness toward the person who snored the loudest throughout your shift. Youngsters who could handle a stick were forced into work, quickly learning that everyone froze, trying, or pulled their weight in the cold. Due to their expertise and, to be honest, the fact that having arthritis made it difficult to lie down and rise back up, grandparents occasionally stayed by the fire for longer. You had to deal with people moving around, animals rustling, wind hammering the walls, and the occasional poke from a brother who had unintentionally rolled over too hard when it was your turn to sleep. It was a wonder that I had good sleep. Nevertheless, the system functioned in spite of the fatigue. A set of eyes and icy, reluctant hands were always ready to keep the hearth burning when people slept in turns. By extension, the family lived, just as the flames did. Therefore, keep in mind the medieval peasant who is staring into a burning fire at 3 in the morning the next time you complain about getting up to change the thermostat or let the cat out, pondering whether toes were actually that significant. When you have to consider how you breathe in order to survive, you know it's cold. Medieval peasants used more than simply cloaks, fireplaces, and inventive sleeping arrangements to combat the frigid temperatures. To survive the night, they even modified their breathing patterns. It was an easy problem. The chilly air was drawn directly into your lungs by deep, open-mouthed breathing. Nobody wanted to take the chance of dying from pneumonia in a world where it could happen faster than you could say, "Hail Mary." Peasants thus acquired the skill of what could be referred to as survival breathing. Rather than taking deep breaths as if they had just finished a marathon, they breathed slowly, shallowly, and most crucially, through their noses. Before the incoming air reached their lungs, it was supposed to be somewhat warmed. Although it wasn't ideal, it was preferable to choking yourself to death by February. Congratulations if you unintentionally swallowed a large amount of frigid air. With no physicians in sight and grandma giving you hot onion tea and stern prayers, you just purchased yourself a ticket to a week of tearing apart what felt like your soul. In order to create a temporary barrier that would keep off cold air, some people even tucked portions of their cloaks, shawls, or rags up over their faces while they slept. Naturally, this also meant that by morning you had a patch of damp, slightly soggy fabric stuck to your tongue. It was better than freezing from the inside out, though. These tactics were taught to children at a young age. During the chilly months, parents would chastise children for panting like dogs indoors. And to be honest, the winters of medieval childhood were a whole new level of character development, with rigorous breathing exercises, itchy wool layers, and sleeping next to a goat that was aggressively gassy. Breathing became an art form at night, nestled next to steaming cow and under heaps of cloaks in straw beds. Like some awful medieval version of a yoga retreat, but with more frostbite and fewer motivational sayings, it was slow, steady, nose only, and as simple as humanly possible. Although it wasn't the most visually appealing tactic in the great survival playbook, it was effective. In the long, unrelenting battle against winter, peasants persevered through another night, one short breath at a time. The peasantry found a surprising secret weapon in the never-ending fight against medieval winter: a full stomach. It turned out that a scratchy woolen cloak wasn't one of the finest ways to ward against the cold. It involved overindulging in a substantial meal just before bed. Warmth was represented by calories. The more you had to digest, the more heat your body generated in the process. It is the fundamentals of medieval thermodynamics. Consume a substantial meal, produce heat internally, and perhaps, just possibly, live till dawn without becoming a popsicle with the shape of a peasant. Before a long, cold night, what would medieval peasants heaped over their plates? Consider hearty stews that are laden with root vegetables such as parsnips, onions, and turnips. Grains also saved lives. Dense, chewy rye, bread, barley grinds, or oat porridge. You may even get a piece of dried sausage or a chunk of salted pork put into the stew if you were particularly fortunate, such as after a celebration day or a bountiful slaughter. This wasn't Instagram-style comfort food. No artistic embellishments, no exquisite presentation. It was a single, massive, hazily brown dinner that was meant to remain in your stomach like a cozy brick, gradually burning through the night to keep you slightly warm. Eating a lot wasn't the only goal. It was about eating wisely. A gradual trickle of warmth was produced by foods that took longer to digest. Not only were foods high in fat commended for their energy content, but also because fat burns more slowly than lean meat. Bread, stew, and a dubious quantity of lard in the belly. The height of winter luxury in the Middle Ages. Even the pickiest kids were fed well by their parents. Little Thomas didn't care if he didn't enjoy turnips. Either you ate the turnips or you spent the night shivering because you missed them so much. Medieval-style parenting that is strict but successful. Of course, there were risks associated with eating a lot at night. Although you might have been warmer, you were also running the risk of having a night filled with vivid, surreal dreams brought on by a stomach that was feverishly trying to digest a field's worth of cabbages. Was it worthwhile? Of course. Peasants weren't ultimately striving for a Michelin-starred feast after all. Their goal was to live. And there was only another night in the never-ending pursuit of another icy dawn if it meant sleeping close to a steaming cow while bloated and breathing softly through your nose. Before the invention of electric blankets and sophisticated heated mattress pads, medieval peasants needed to find inventive ways to stay warm before bed, and thus the ever-glamorous heating stone and the unassuming haybox became the unsung heroes of winter. Now let's talk about the haybox. It sounds rough, and it was, but the concept was brilliant. Food that had been cooked earlier would be kept warm for hours by peasants using a robust wooden box lined with thick layers of hay. It remained hot enough for a late-night snack without running the risk of starting the fire again when leftover stew or hot porridge was thrown into the haybox and covered. Basically, medieval slow cookers. Peasants, however, did not limit themselves to food. They came to the conclusion that hay could retain the heat from something even better if it could do the same for a stew pot. Rocks. The heated stone era begins. Someone, most likely the unfortunate child who lost the family argument, would pick up a flat stone and throw it into the center of the fireplace before going to bed. They would use a stick or some old tongs to fish it out after roasting it until it was almost too hot to touch, and a thin line between helpful and third degree burned. They would carefully wrap the stone in rags, tuck it into an old piece of fabric, or jam it into a clay pot, and then place it under the hay in the mattress or at the foot of the bed, still radiating pleasant warmth. A heating pad from the Middle Ages, prepared to fight the frozen ground. There were risks, of course. Congratulations if you failed to correctly wrap the stone. Now you had a minor localized fire in your home. And let's just say that slipping on ice wasn't always the cause of winter injuries if you dropped it on your foot. However, when all went well, that stone offered hours of priceless, reassuring warmth. Although it wasn't opulent, living in a half-frozen hut meant that you weren't supposed to wake up with icicles hanging from your nose. A heated pebble nestled in some hay may not seem like a glamorous addition to the vast arsenal of medieval winter survival tools, but it was a small miracle for peasants who were desperate for any heat they could find. The hearth was used for more than just preparing meals in a medieval peasant's dwelling. It was almost like a member of the family, a smoky, erratic, and occasionally uncooperative family member, to be sure, but vital to survival, particularly when it came to sleeping. You had a better chance of waking up unfrozen the closer you were to the fire. This meant that sleeping arrangements were more about strategic placement than personal taste. Priority access to premium real estate was granted to infants, the elderly, and anybody ill or fragile. From there, parents, older children, and more resilient adults spread out like layers of human insulation. It was more than simply goodwill to be given a place near the fire. It was simple maths for survival. Elders were invaluable sources of family wisdom and, let's face it, the best gossip, while babies were delicate heat producers. There was no denying the importance of providing them with prime warmth. However, roasting by the fire was not all that pleasant. Too near, and you might wake up with your cloak smoldering suspiciously or your hair singed. You were essentially camping in an ice box if you went too far. The dance was delicate. Remain close enough to enjoy the glow of the fire, but not so close that you had to tell your neighbor that you now resembled a half-cooked roast. Moreover, the fire did not disperse heat uniformly. Most of the time, it burnt the people right in front of it, while everyone else struggled like icy lizards for a sunbeam over the tiny cone of fire. One side of your body may be wonderfully warm while the other is frozen so solid that you could definitely knock on it if you were fortunate enough to sleep with your back to the fire. Naturally, pets and livestock also contributed. With its tail waving perilously near an open flame, a dog may push itself between you and the fire. Occasionally, like little feathered protectors of warmth, chickens would perch precariously on hearthstones and cluck gently into the night. Every shift of burning embers and every crackle of the logs was a tiny hope. You're still alive. For now, you're still warm. Thus, lulled by the pops and hisses of the fire, peasants fell into restless slumber, each breath creating little clouds in the cold air outside the fire's delicate circle. It wasn't flawless. It was uncomfortable, but it was life, a string of blazing coals holding on to warmth. Nobody in the medieval period made it through the winter by themselves, unless they wished to turn into a fashionable frozen statue by January. Family was not the only factor in survival. The project was a village endeavor. Everyone's life and warmth depended on everyone else in this muddy, noisy, and untidy partnership. The villagers understood that a mound of hay and a powerful fire could only go so far in the dead of winter. You would notice if your neighbor's house turned dark. Someone went to see if the smoke billowing into the sky from old Tom's hearth had abruptly stopped. Additionally, community meant survival, not only because Tom owed you a chicken, though that may have played a role. Villages had informal winter watchers, usually young or old, who were unable to work the fields, but could monitor who was coughing excessively, who hadn't been the market to trade for a few days, or whose house appeared a bit too motionless in the morning frost. With a lot more sheep and no fluorescent vests, these folks were the medieval equivalent of neighborhood patrol. It was a near emergency if a family's fire went out. A decent neighbor would either invite them into their own smoky, packed hut for the night, or hurry over with a blazing coal wrapped in rags. It was better than finding frozen companions come spring thaw, even though it meant packing an additional 4 individuals into an already small area. Local grocery stores also had an impact. Villagers occasionally pulled their last dried vegetables, grain, and stored meat during particularly harsh winters. The charity was gloomy. A few shared meals could be the difference between stumbling into spring or not, but nobody had much. The stakes were clear even to youngsters. When someone needed assistance, they ran important messages, shared embers, and assisted with wood deliveries. Winter arrived, and no one was too small or too exhausted. Yes, there was more to medieval villages than sunlight and love. Feuds took place. Land disputes, goat disputes, or disagreements about who borrowed a fine cooking kettle never completely went away. However, past grudges were frequently gently put aside when the nights were extremely cold. Ultimately, it was still worthwhile to arrive, because you might require rescue tomorrow. The hamlet became into one large, unyielding family throughout the bitterly cold winter months. Occasionally dysfunctional, frequently humorous, and always strongly committed to surviving together. One frozen smile, one crackling fire, and one muddy boot at a time. Medieval peasants did more than simply fuel the fire and layer on cloaks when they confronted the harsh winter cold. They said a lot of prayers. You wanted every edge you could get, even a little supernatural intervention when the fire dwindled to sullen embers and the wind howled like wolves outside your paper-thin walls. Back then, faith was more than just a Sunday activity. Every frigid breath has it weaved into it. Families would kneel together and offer hasty prayers to preserve the roof intact, the fire alive, and their toes linked by dawn before sliding under layers of scratchy wool and straw. Saints evolved into more than just ethereal divine beings. They were the first line of defense for winter. For example, Samay was asked to guard against throat conditions. When you could cough out your soul with just one mouthful of frigid air, it's not a small matter. In subsequent tradition, St. Nicholas was more than just the cheerful giver of gifts. In the lean, lethal months, he was also asked to keep houses safe from unexpected destruction. Superstitions tightly encircled day-to-day existence. Before going to bed, some families sprayed a little amount of holy water close to the fireplace in the hopes of warding off evil spirits or, at the very least, cunning drafts. After some feast days, others used blessed chalk to mark doorways, hoping that good fortune and warmth would bring them inside. Candles were also included. Occasionally, special vigil candles were kept burning all night long as a flickering appeal against the icy darkness tearing at the walls. These candles were frequently blessed by the village priest or the most devout elderly woman. Of course, without a few pledges, no serious winter prayer session would be complete. I promise to be better to my neighbor, even the one who keeps stealing our turnips, if you only help us get through this evening, Lord. Faith wasn't some ethereal solace. It was an intense talk every day. The peasants only wanted to survive, not luxury. A little food, a little warmth, and another day to struggle through until spring loosened its icy hold on their small communities. They managed to get through the lengthy, harsh winter nights by whispering simple, unadulterated optimism into the smoky rafters, wrapped in panting prayers and nestled beneath itching blankets. The truth was cold, despite the medieval peasants' inventiveness, prayers, and stubbornness. It wasn't always enough. And it took more than a few unfortunate people when winter triumphed. Whole villages and entire families were lost in quiet under a thick layer of snow and ice. Particularly harsh winters occurred, such as the notorious Great Famine Winter of 1315, when frigid temperatures converted an already harsh existence into a long, grinding catastrophe. Cattle starved and rains damaged crops. Stories of eating shoe leather, bark, and in the worst situations one another, circulated because people were so desperate. It wasn't only a hassle when the fire wasn't maintained. Frequently, it was a death sentence. Families crowded around for the last time without the scant warmth of the hearth. In the spring, neighbors would occasionally come across entire households. Until the very end, bodies remained frozen in one another's grasp, seemingly attempting to share a bit more heat. Overwhelming snowfall or violent ice storms could cause houses to collapse. Not only was it disastrous when a roof collapsed in the middle of a freezing night, it was frequently lethal. It wasn't a given that you would drag yourself through thigh-deep snow to ask your neighbors for a place to stay, particularly if those neighbors were already under a lot of stress. The cold also appealed to disease. Smoky, claustrophobic houses were breeding grounds for bronchitis, pneumonia, and other lethal illnesses, while starvation weakened the body. By January, a minor cough in December might quickly turn into a funeral. Then there was frostbite, a silent misery. As they remained connected to their masters, their fingers, toes, and even ears became black and died. Some villagers lost limbs in order to survive the winter, but more disturbing than the death itself is the uncanny normalcy of it. A bleak badge of honor that said, "I made it through, but winter took a piece of me." People came to terms with the fact that some of them would not see the thaw every winter. Death came as no surprise. At the door, waiting its turn, it was simply another neighbor, coated in frost. Medieval peasants persevered, obstinate, mourning and holding on to life despite the extreme cold and ongoing danger, because there was still a fight worth fighting as long as there was one breath remaining in the frigid air and one ember remaining in the hearth. It's easy to focus simply on the struggles of medieval peasants, those muddy, frost-bitten survivors of interminable winters and their cracked hands, chilled toes, and smoke-choked homes. However, something much more potent lies beneath all of that conflict, a heritage of unadulterated, unyielding inventiveness and unwavering perseverance. They lacked comfortable memory foam beds, thermal coats, and central heating. The luxury of expecting they would live until spring was not even available to them. The resiliency blueprint, however, was what they left behind and what they did have. Every moss-scrammed wall gap, every hand-banked fire, and every haystead mattress was evidence of human ingenuity under duress. They did not give up in the face of insurmountable obstacles. They adjusted. They gained knowledge from the land, from one another, and from the harsh lessons that each harsh winter had to teach them. More than just common ground served as the foundation for their communities. Their foundation was mutual survival. They taught one another how to take care of the sick, how to use resources when food was running low, and how to have faith that if you help a neighbor who is freezing now, someone could help you tomorrow. They lived on the principle that nobody can survive winter by himself. Their faith was also a form of perseverance. They incorporate prayers into their daily lives, out of hope as well as fear. Fragile, unyielding hope that things might be a bit warmer and brighter tomorrow. I hoped that after 100 gloomy nights, spring would return and life would somehow break through the ice. And it did, somehow. Future generations prospered as a result of their sacrifices, their modest triumphs, and their ability to weather one more night and one more storm. They advanced humanity bit by bit, surviving harsh winters that their forebears could hardly endure until warmth and comfort were no longer far-fetched ideals, but rather the norm. Our current way of life is imperceptibly woven with their blood, sweat, and inventiveness. Every warm house, every comfortable blanket, and every leisurely winter evening spent drinking tea when the lights were soft. The result of innumerable medieval peasants' refusal to succumb to the cold is all of this. Perhaps think of them the next time the wind howls outside your double-paned window. The unnamed, courageous people who transform shivering survival into a legacy that endures. One breath, one obstinate heartbeat, one flame at a time. There were no troops at her feet or a crown on Anne Boleyn's head when she was born. She was born in 1501, most likely at Blickling Hall or Hare Castle. the daughter of Elizabeth Howard, a noblewoman with strong familial ties, and Thomas Boleyn, an aspirational ambassador. Anne's birth hardly made an impression on Tudor society as a whole. However, something remarkable was emerging from these humble beginnings. A life that would eventually change how English history unfolded. Anne was distinguished from a young age by her intellect rather than her money. She was intelligent, vivacious, and, by all accounts, captivating. Her education really started when her family sent her to the continent after realizing her potential. She first served Margaret of Austria in the glitzy Dutch court, something that few English females could hope to do. Anne learnt the intricate dance of European politics, the art of diplomacy, and elegant manners there. However, Anne's genius was really refined in France. She learnt the language of influence, elegance, flirting, and humor throughout her years in the opulent courts of queens, Claude and Marguerite of Navarre. As other young ladies honed their needlework, Anne became an expert at conversation, intrigue, and how to command attention without ever appearing to ask for it. Anne was a unique lady by the time she returned to England in the early 1520s. She had the ambition of a rising English house and could compete with the elegance of continental courtiers. She was far from a traditional beauty. She was arresting, even her fans acknowledged that. Under layers of courtly grace, there was a fast, melodic voice, dark eyes that glowed with intelligence, and a manner of moving that implied purpose. Anne altered the gravity of rooms rather than merely entering them. Anne refused to quietly fade into obscurity during a period when a woman's destiny was frequently determined by her birth and marriage. She had witnessed the influence that intelligence and charm could have in foreign courts, and she planned to use that understanding back home. At the time, Anne Boleyn was a young woman with ambition, intelligence, and no experience. But history was already starting to take shape around her. The girl who went back to England was more than just the daughter of Thomas Boleyn. She was a participant in a bigger game that would soon overtake the actual crown. The nobility had never seen anyone like Anne Boleyn when she returned to the English court. In a world full of demure, pale-faced English roses, Anne was a lightning bolt, unpredictable, electrifying, and unavoidable. At first, she played the part expected of her, a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon. But her black hair, bold eyes, and quick, keen wit distinguished her from the mild, submissive ladies who occupied King Henry VIII's court. However, Anne's presence glowed like a candle that was too bright to extinguish, even in the Queen's shadow. She laughed with a confidence few women dared to show, spoke French fluently, and danced elegantly. Men took attention, women engaged in gossiping. The attractive Berlin girl caused a quiet commotion in the court. She soon attracted the king's attention, which is the most perilous of all. Feigning was nothing new to Henry VIII. His court was a haven of covert liaisons and whispered promises. Anne, however, was unique. Unlike so many others, she didn't fawn at his praise or jump into his arms with excitement. She made fun of it. She posed a challenge. She declined. A man accustomed to instant adoration, Henry was enthralled. He plummeted farther the more Anne kept him at arm's length. They exchanged letters that were full of expressions of desire, annoyance, and love. The most influential unofficial post at court, that of royal mistress, was what Henry gave her. Incredibly, Anne refused. She wouldn't be a forgotten mistress lost to time or just another conquest. Henry would have to marry her if he wanted her. The court was taken aback by the boldness of the gamble. The king was already married, after all. The populace adored his queen, Catherine, who was fiercely guarded by her nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor. Henry couldn't claim Anne unless he disobeyed the church itself. Anne, however, did not recoil. She had lived in European courts where queens painted smiles and used lace fans to exert soft power. Although she was aware that ambition was a risky game, she nevertheless planned to win. Anne Boleyn took the decision to alter both her own and England's futures forever, while standing in the candlelit halls of the English court, not just to be admired. King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's passionate courtship quickly descended into a national emergency. Henry was more than just enamored. He had an obsession, and he was prepared to destroy everything that England had known for generations in order to fulfill his passion. There was a minor setback to the king's plan to wed Anne. In particular, Queen Catherine of Aragon was already his wife. Dignified and strong, Catherine would not meekly move aside. In the eyes of God and the English, she was the legitimate queen, and she had been Henry's faithful wife for 20 years. Not only was divorce scandalous, but it was practically unimaginable. Henry, however, was adamant. Because Catherine had previously been married to his brother Arthur, he persuaded himself and others that his marriage to her was doomed. Ignore the fact that years ago the Pope had given their union special authorization. Henry now maintained that unless he annulled the marriage, his soul would be condemned. For her part, Anne knew better than to seem overly excited. She alternated between bolstering Henry's hopes and keeping her distance, keeping herself just out of reach. Every look and every word had a purpose. She had more in mind than marriage. She was setting herself up to rule England as queen. There were factions and murmurs throughout the court. As the winds of power shifted, several noble families ardently courted Anne's favor. Others, appalled by the thought of Anne taking her place, clung tenaciously to Queen Catherine. Desperate letters were sent back to Rome by diplomats. Retaliation was threatened by foreign monarchs. Uncomfortably, Henry's own advisors moved. They could feel the earth quivering underfoot. Henry's frustration increased as the months stretched into years. He persuaded his attorneys to look for weaknesses, flooded the Pope with petitions, and gradually came to understand that the Church would not budge. Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew and the most powerful man in Europe, was one of her strong allies. Henry persisted despite counsel, custom, and more the law itself. His courting of Anne had evolved into something far more than just passion. The fundamental framework of England's political and religious life was now under threat. Anne was doing more than just winning over a king. She was taking a whole kingdom into unknown territory. There was no going back once the risky game had started. Anne Boleyn's risk paid off after nearly 7 torturous years of scheming, intrigue, and diplomatic turmoil. She secretly wed Henry VIII in January 1533, which was a brave decision considering that, in the eyes of the Pope and most of Europe, he was still legally married to Catherine of Aragon. In a sumptuous ceremony held at Westminster Abbey by June, Anne was crowned Queen of England. The scene was far from uniformly happy, yet it should have been the climax of her life. Londoners looked on with fatigued eyes. While some mumbled prayers for Queen Catherine, others cheered. Many questioned if this new queen's bold spirit and French graces were a boon or a bane. Anne came into her throne as a storm rather than a loving person. Anne was brilliant, controversial, and politically astute, in contrast to Catherine, who personified the traditional English virtues of humility and piety. She made formidable adversaries with amazing quickness, donned striking colors, and led the court with keen insight. Although she appeared to be in a comfortable position, it was actually extremely vulnerable. The only thing that mattered was giving Henry a male heir. Anne was as well aware of this as anyone. She was no longer just Henry's lover. She was a dynasty's hope. In the initial stages of her pregnancy, Anne and Henry were overjoyed and positive the child would be male. However, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, a girl, in September of 1533. Insisting that the next kid would undoubtedly be a boy, Anne, to her credit, managed to hide her heartbreaking sorrow with elegance. Henry, though, was less calm. His once adoring gaze now wavered with uncertainty. Nevertheless, Anne's light shone brightly for a while. She became the first queen in English history, transformed the English court in her image, and brought her family to previously unheard-of heights. Crowned with the holy oil often saved for monarchs, she had a huge impact. Ambassadors from other countries asked for her favor. In order to gain her favor, couriers rearranged their connections. The once submissive Henry started formally separating England from Rome by establishing the Church of England, which he led, all in order to prevent anyone from questioning Anne's throne. However, ominous clouds loomed even in her victory. Behind their hands, friends whispered. Henry, erratic and restless, was already starting to look past the clever woman who had rewritten the kingdom for him, as rivals hovered, waiting. It would take more than charm, ambition, or even love for Anne to maintain her position as queen. Almost no woman in her era had climbed as high as Anne Boleyn. However, the fall is more difficult the higher you go. The fissures in her universe showed almost immediately when she put the crown on her head. The urge to have a male successor was the main source of Anne's difficulties. Time was running out since her first child, Elizabeth, was not the son Henry V had pinned his dynastic hopes on, despite being intelligent and healthy. In a short period of time, Anne became pregnant several times, but heartbreak ensued, miscarriages that left her emotionally and physically exhausted. Every kid she lost eroded the foundation she had established. Once fervently committed, Henry started to distance himself. His dissatisfaction caused a breach between them. Never one to endure pain in silence, Anne resisted, demanded, and fought for her position. However, Henry, a man who valued obedience just as highly as beauty, became weary of her acerbic nature, her disobedience, and the very ferocity that had initially captivated him. Enemies gathered, like wolves outside the royal rooms. Several aristocrats who had gritted their teeth to put up with Anne's ascent now openly plotted her demise. Supporters of Catherine of Aragon never forgiven Anne for what they saw to be sacrilege and robbery. She was referred to as the Great in Whispers by commoners who blamed her for the break with Rome and the subsequent oppressive reforms. Jane Seymour followed. Just as Anne's influence started to wane, Henry's wandering attention was drawn to Jane, who was quiet, demure, and everything Anne was not. Jane provided calming cooperation where Anne had astonished him with her intelligence and challenge. As observant as ever, Anne understood that the shift was harmful. By giving Henry a lot of attention, promising additional boys, and pleading for patience, she attempted to regain her position. However, the erratic king had already started to see his existence without the woman he had previously destroyed a whole kingdom for. Thomas Cromwell, Anne's erstwhile ally, was among her political adversaries who felt the shift. They started preparing the ground for a destructive campaign, gathering witnesses, rumors, and accusations in silence. The woman who had so skillfully engaged in the perilous game of ambition was now losing ground. Anne's bravery and guile had earned her the throne. However, prior triumphs held little significance in the harsh and ever-changing realm of Henry's court. Anne's opponents were honing their blades, and only new success counted. Soon, the queen who had destroyed a country would witness firsthand how easily she could be destroyed by a kingdom. Swords and armies were not used by Anne Boleyn's adversaries to assault her. They arrived with highly honed falsehoods, secrets, and murmurs. Betrayal simmered in the court's back rooms. Quiet, patient, and lethal. Once Anne's strongest supporter during the English Reformation, Thomas Cromwell, had turned against her. The foundation of their union had been shared ambition, but suddenly their objectives were at odds. Anne favored changes to aid the underprivileged and curtail the influence of avaricious aristocrats. Cromwell desired no intervention, stability, and Henry's favor. Anne had been dangerous because of her audacity, and love had turned into annoyance, mistrust, and icy disinterest in Henry's erratic heart. Anne had lost most of her real friends. Once her greatest asset, her charm now irritated the court's desire for a softer, more accommodating queen. And Jane Seymour waited just out of sight, silent and strategic. It was the ideal counterpoint to Anne's dying fire. Knowing that Henry was agitated and that the monarch desired to leave but had no easy reason, Cromwell took the initiative and provided a solution. What if Anne could be removed by disgrace rather than divorce, which would make Henry feel inferior? The charges were outrageous and heinous, including incest, adultery, and plotting against the king. The arrogant, intelligent Queen Anne is shown as a treacherous, seductive, and dangerous threat to the very throne she once reconstructed. Cromwell meticulously collected evidence, using torture to entice confessions and turn courtly fancies into incriminating testimony. George Berlin, Anne's own brother, was among the men who were taken into custody. The charges were illogical. They were rife with inconsistencies and impossible situations. Truth, however, was whatever the monarch required it to be in Henry's court. Anne struggled valiantly as she felt the rope tighten. She made an unsuccessful attempt to evoke Henry's memory or the love they had once had. Now he would not look into her eyes, the guy who had previously torn England apart for her. Anne was detained and brought to the Tower of London in May of 1536. She realized the reality when the big gate banged behind her. She was not a queen anymore. She was a prisoner, a captive caught in the cruel game she had so skillfully played before. Her fate had been sealed by betrayal. Anne Boleyn was now waiting for the last move by herself in the Tower. A tribunal of nobles, many of whom owed their own titles and wealth to Anne Boleyn's ascent, stood before her in the vast hall of the Tower of London. They sat in judgment now, icy and vigilant, ready to destroy the lady who had once altered England's course. The accusations made against her were startling. High treason, conspiracy against the monarch, and adultery with several men, including her own brother, George Berlin. Such charges against a queen would have been unimaginable in a different universe. However, they were now only theater, a somber production created to suit Henry VII's every want. Under the slender guise of legality, Anne fell from grace. The same fire that had won Henry's heart was used by Anne to defend herself. Even her adversaries were amazed by her brilliance, accuracy, and unflinching poise as she refuted each charge. She reminded them that she had been anointed as Queen of England, chosen by God and crowned with sacred oil. She reaffirmed her love, sacrifice, and loyalty to them. However, it was all in vain. Long before Anne entered the courtroom, the verdict had been rendered. A once unbreakable woman was publicly unmade throughout the trial, which was a sight for both the court and the audience. Witness after witness, many of whom were bribed or forced to testify, spoke negatively. Places and dates were inconsistent. When there was evidence, it was weak. But now the truth didn't matter. Anne was convicted. George, her brother, and the other men who were charged with her were also given death sentences. Unlike the typical traitor's death of hanging, drawing, and quartering, Anne would be executed by beheading, which is a kinder punishment. She stood erect, her face pallid, but her spirit stubbornly intact when the decision was read and did not shatter. She spoke plainly in the last few minutes before being escorted back to her cell, saying that she was ready to die and asking God to spare her soul. The court breathed a sigh of relief as the hall's massive doors closed behind her. Anne had been dazzling, dangerous, unforgettable, and the storm was almost done. Even still, they were unable to comprehend. Anne Boleyn was not being erased. They were making her a symbol of sorrow, betrayal, and folklore. Following her trial, Anne Boleyn was brought back to the Tower of London as a condemned prisoner who was about to die, rather than as the victorious queen who had once ruled England. But Anne refused to give up, even in the face of death. Anne braced herself in the chilly, reverberating tower hallways. Kneeling on the hard stone floors, her hands held securely, her voice steady, she prayed for hours. She thought she had done no crimes, so she didn't confess to any. She claimed that she had no fear of dying, but she prayed that her passing would bring about peace in the kingdom and possibly even mercy for her young daughter, Elizabeth. Private tears were shed by her ladies-in-waiting, the ones who had remained faithful. Rather of the other way around, Anne soothed them. Sometimes she quipped sourly that people would remember her as a headless queen. The obstinate spark that had made her memorable was present in her black humor. Meanwhile, Henry VIII was unforgiving. He was already thinking about Jane Seymour. Henry was planning his next marriage even before Anne's execution date was set. This last betrayal from the man who had once destroyed a kingdom for her may have been the most painful wound for Anne. Anne was informed that she would pass away the following morning on May 18th, 1536. That night, she didn't get much sleep. Rather, she prayed in her last hours, pleading with God to pardon her for the wrongs done to her and possibly for her own vanity and ambition that had brought her to this point. In an act of royal benevolence, Henry had arranged for a French swordsman to do the death because he was quicker, cleaner, and less cruel than an axe. Perhaps more for the king's conscience than for Anne's comfort, it was a minor favor. Anne got ready for her last moment at daybreak, a red kirt underneath a dark gray damask gown with fur trim, colors of sacrifice and dignity. She prepared to confront the blade with poise by tucking her dark hair under a plain hat and pinning it up. Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, fighter, survivor, moved forward as the chilly morning mist of the tower coiled over the stones of the courtyard. There would be no cries or requests, just one last brave deed in the face of history's condemnation. Her story was just getting started, but her demise was imminent. Anne Boleyn climbed the scaffold inside the walls of the Tower of London early on May 19, 1536. Courtiers, guards, a few witnesses, and a small group of people gathered in stillness as though the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. With her grey gown billowing slightly in the chilly morning wind, Anne stood tall. Her face was calm but pale, and she appeared thinner than she had at court. No hysteria or broken sobbing were heard. She approached death, if anything, with the same fiery dignity that had once shocked a kingdom into submission. Her final words were carefully chosen as she spoke short. She made no accusations. She didn't stand up for herself. She prayed for the king, the guy who had deserted her, to be well and prosperous. In her last moments, Anne gave forgiveness to the world instead of a confession. Even those who had come to witness her fall were astounded by her bravery. The French executioner, who had been summoned specifically to guarantee a speedy demise, came forward. With her hands folded in prayer and her gaze raised to the sky, Anne knelt up. Her eyes were tied with a tiny piece of white linen. She didn't move. With a single, silent, quick flash of the blade, Anne Boleyn, queen, mother, and history maker, was gone. No formal coffin had been made for her, so she was buried in an arrow chest in an unmarked cemetery within the tower grounds. A gold-crowned queen was abandoned to disappear without a ceremony. But that icy tomb wasn't where Anne's story ended. One of the most successful queens in English history would be her daughter Elizabeth, whose birth had once let a king down. During the reign of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, English art, power, and influence around the world would flourish. A queen who possessed her mother's ferocity, intellect, and unwavering fortitude. England was irrevocably altered by Anne Boleyn. The rupture with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England was sparked in part by her ambition. Her downfall demonstrated to the world that even monarchs might be disregarded. However, Anne's legacy shone brighter through her blood and Elizabeth than any crown she had ever worn. Anne Boleyn ultimately gained a sort of immortality, not by surviving, but by leaving a lasting impression on history. The American colonies were simmering like a stew left over a blazing fire for too long by the early 1770s. Once seen as the proud mother country, the relationship with Britain had soured into suspicion, hatred, and increasing rage. Tea hadn't been the beginning. The Stamp Act, which imposed tariffs on everything from playing cards to newspapers, had infuriated colonists years before. The Townshend Acts, which imposed taxes on necessities like paint, paper, and glass, came next. It was like a spark landing in dry brush every time a new legislation was made by a parliament thousands of miles away from the colonists. Initially, the rage manifested itself in flaming pamphlets and courteous petitions. Formal protests were drafted by colonial assemblies. Boycotts were organized by merchants. Newspapers were filled with fervent debates over liberty and rights from authors like John Dickinson and Samuel Adams. However, frustration turned into something more sinister over time, gradually realizing that Britain was not paying attention. Even worse, Britain showed little concern. Many colonists held on to the belief that Parliament would remove the taxes if they made enough noise and used enough logic, and occasionally they succeeded. Following a clamorous colonial protest, the Stamp Act was famously repealed. However, every minor triumph was followed by new laws, taxes, and taunts. The money wasn't the point. Actually, it was never. By British standards, the taxes were hardly high. The principle was what enraged the colonists. They were being governed like remote property rather than partners, taxed without their agreement and treated more like subjects than citizens. More than any other city, Boston turned to become the center of resistance. The Sons of Liberty, a ferocious, clandestine gang of patriots, became more vocal and audacious. Tensions escalated into bloodshed in 1770 during the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers opened fire on defenseless people. The cobblestones were already smeared with blood. There was no longer any trust. The colonies were on the verge of collapse by 1773. The peaceful, seemingly innocuous shape of boxes heaped with tea was the ultimate insult that would edge them into open resistance, and it came not in the form of soldiers, new laws, or armies. The night the tea drifted in the chilly waters of Boston Harbor would forever alter the course of history, even though the colonists were unaware of it at the time. Parliament made a crucial error in judgment in 1773. They passed the Tea Act, which was intended to preserve the floundering British East India Company and, incidentally, reaffirm Britain's authority to tax the American colonies because they thought the colonies would silently accept cheaper tea. It appeared to be a terrific deal on paper. By eliminating middlemen and lowering prices, the Tea Act enabled the firm to sell tea directly to the colonies, providing a luxury good at a significantly reduced cost. What might go wrong? Everything. Because the underlying idea was the issue, not the cost of the tea. The infamous tea tax was retained in place by the Tea Act. To accept the tea, even at a reduced price, would be to concede the colonies' right to be taxed by Parliament without their permission. That seemed unimaginable to many Americans, a ceding of the freedoms they had spent over 10 years fighting for. Throughout the colonies, word of the Tea Act spread like wildfire. The merchants were angry. They perceived a monopoly that would stifle local trade as a threat to their livelihood. The concealed message infuriated the patriots. The Crown continued to think it could do as it pleased. The response was particularly vehement in Boston. After years of economic suffering and the Boston Massacre, Boston was already traumatized, so residents saw the Tea Act for what it was, a scam masquerading as a deal. Refusing the tea turned into an honorable decision that served as a barometer for commitment to the cause of liberty. Public gatherings increased, firebrand hyperbole blazed from newspaper columns. Boycotts were organized by organizations like the Sons of Liberty, who were led by Samuel Adams and others. They made a commitment that no tea from the East India Company would be sold, unloaded, or consumed in the United States. Local opposition forced ships carrying the contentious tea to turn away throughout the colonies. The message was unmistakable in ports from Charleston to New York. We won't be purchased. However, things turned out differently in Boston. After arriving, 3 ships, the Beaver, the Elalana, and the Dartmouth, anchored in the harbor and sat there, refusing to depart. Royal representatives demanded that the tea be unloaded. The colonists declined. When Tortosa pulled bowring, a stalemate developed. The strain was intolerable. It would be broken by a single deed, and history would never be the same. The city itself became a powder keg, while the British tea ship sat obstinately docked in Boston Harbor. The strain increased with each day that went by without a resolution. Boston was not simply putting up a fight, it was getting ready to fight. Infuriated colonists discussed their options in public squares, churches, and bars. The Sons of Liberty organized resistance quickly under the leadership of fiery speakers like Paul Revere, John Hancock, and Samuel Adams. They conducted raucous meetings that drew a large number of farmers, artisans, and merchants, and they put up public notices urging people to boycott British tea. Every meeting fueled the flames. The resistance's nerve center was the former South Meeting House. The wooden hall was packed with thousands of people, their voices rising in defiance as their breath mingled with the air. Resolutions, speeches, and heated arguments took place here. Every vote that opposed the tea's dumping was a further blow to British power. The time was running out, yet Bostonians remained united. Tea and other imported products had to be unloaded and the tax paid within 20 days, according to British legislation. Customs officers would confiscate the cargo and collect the levy by force if the ship stayed over the deadline. Even if they protested, the Sons of Liberty knew that the principle would be lost once the levy was paid. The tea was no longer the only thing at stake. The question was whether the colonies would rise up and defend their future, or if they would accept being treated like subjects with no rights. Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, dug in his heels in the meanwhile. He insisted that the law be followed and would not allow the tea ships to go before emptying their cargo. Forget about colonial fury. He believed that giving up would entail acknowledging that the colonies were governed by mobs rather than kings. The standoff in Boston turned into a show. Every child, mother, and man understood that something was about to happen. The cold, acute awareness that precedes a storm when everyone holds their breath was palpable in the air. An explosion would be triggered by a single spark. And a decision was subtly forming somewhere in Boston's congested streets and hearts. A strategy that would reverberate throughout empires and oceans. Over Boston, a city poised on the brink of history, the morning of December 16th, 1773, dawned gray and cold. The tea ships had been sitting in the harbor like ticking time bombs for almost 3 weeks. The last deadlines had now come. British legislation stipulated that within 20 days of a ship's arrival, the tea had to be unloaded and the tax paid. If it wasn't, British military might be summoned in to execute the law, and customs authorities might confiscate the cargo. Everyone was aware of it. Everyone was aware of the stakes. The idea was lost if the tea came ashore. The colonists' claim to liberty and rights would be undermined if they permitted it, even after their cause was established. The Old South Meeting House, the town's largest structure, was crowded that morning with thousands of Boston residents and colonists from the surrounding area. To get there, some had traveled kilometers on foot across the frozen countryside. Men poured out onto the streets to listen to the ferocious speeches that reverberated through the halls because the assembly was so crowded. The meeting was chaired by the iron voice of insurrection, Samuel Adams. Speaker after speaker took the platform to condemn the Tea Act, to protest oppression, and to call for swift action. However, uncertainty lingered despite the defiance. What could be done that wouldn't lead to a full-scale conflict? How could they halt the tea without allowing ruthless reprisals to break out? Riders were galloping in with bleak tidings as the afternoon went on. Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, was unconvinced. Without unloading, the ships would not be permitted to depart. The king's law would be upheld, the tea confiscated, and the tax collected. The crowd erupted in rage. The force of it seemed to tremble the meeting house's walls. However, Samuel Adams remained composed and said the words that put an end to the argument. There is nothing else this assembly can do to preserve the nation. A short sentence. However, everyone was aware of its meaning. Compromises and petitions would cease to exist. There would be action. A war whoop sliced through the encroaching darkness outside. The signal. Men swiftly hid themselves by dousing their faces with soot and feigning Mohawk warriors with feathers and blankets. There was no intention of deceiving anyone. Making a symbol, a message that no one could misinterpret, was the goal. It was past the deadline. Boston would respond with resistance rather than words. On December 16, 1773, the peaceful streets of Boston started to stir as twilight grew deeper over the city. Through the shadows came figures, common men with soot-blackened faces, some with feathers, wrapped in ragged blankets. These had no intention of deceiving anyone into thinking these were actual Mohawks. Their disguise served as a symbolic gesture of letting go of their previous identities and assuming a new, powerful persona. They traveled in their dozens to Griffin's Wharf, where the 3 tea ships, the Beaver, the Eleanor, and the Dartmouth, were anchored. Beneath them, the harbor water swirled, dark and frigid, heavy with the acrid sting of winter. There was no yelling or inebriated mayhem. There was no riot here. It was a task executed with cool, brutal accuracy. With clubs and hatchets in hand, the colonists in disguise overran the ships, overwhelming the few remaining crew members. The sailors did not suffer any injuries. They were shoved aside and silently observed while the procedure got underway. The smell of fresh tea spilt into the chilly night air as men used practiced blows to split open the wooden trunks. Others tossed the crates over the side, their loud splashes resonating through the harbor's quiet waters. A total of 342 chests were shattered and discarded until thousands of pounds of tea leaves swirled in the black water. Silent, awed spectators watched from the wharf. Nearby British guards did not attempt to step in. It's unclear if it's out of perplexity, pity, or fear of increasing violence. According to some reports, there was an agreement even among British loyalists. Tonight, there would be no halting the change that had occurred. The level of discipline was remarkable. There was no cargo theft. The ships were not looted for valuables. The only thing targeted was tea, the despised emblem of British rule. The men might have easily used the protest as a pretext for robbing in a town where poverty and hunger were everyday occurrences. No, they didn't. After it was over, the harbor looked like a huge churning cauldron full of soaked tea leaves and ripped chests. A weird, bittersweet smell filled the night air as the harsh tang of broken tea blended with the perfume of the sea. The task was completed. The men vanished silently into the darkness, disappearing into Boston's back streets and alleys. They merely left behind the recognizable stamp of revolution. No names, no leaders, no claims to renown. Boston stood motionless, nearly holding its breath as the final shattered crates bobbed in the black water. The Boston Tea Party was neither a drunken spectacle, a riot, or a fight. Under the cover of darkness, it was an act of cold, purposeful defiance. Something much uncommon. The harbor was turned into a huge teapot that swirled. The water was stained black by the thousands of pounds of East India Company tea that floated over it in large mats. When several inquisitive and disobedient colonists picked up handfuls of damp leaves from the harbor, the Sons of Liberty on patrol around the docks reprimanded them. There was nothing to save. The work done tonight would not benefit anyone. This was straightforward, pure principle. The next morning, the community awoke to the lingering scent of salty tea. Like wildfire, news spread, letters, word of mouth, and broad sheets. Everyone knew what had transpired by noon, from merchants to apprentices. Opinions also diverged quickly. The fact that common people had defied the world's most powerful empire and fought for freedom inspired a strong, swollen sense of pride among patriots. There was horror among moderates and loyalists. They saw property damage as risky and careless. Had the colonies gone too far and been unable to turn back? In his home, Governor Thomas Hutchinson was incensed not only at the devastation, but also at the message it conveyed. Where else would revolt begin if the king's authority could be so flagrantly disregarded as in Boston? British officials were taken aback. Boycotts, protests, and maybe another riot, similar to the ones that had erupted over the Stamp Act, were what they had anticipated. It had surprised them that well-trained, orderly revolutionaries could ruin tens of thousands of pounds of royal property without even smashing a window. The captains of the Dartmouth, Ellelanena, and Beaver were unable to do anything but watch as their cargo vanished beneath the waters. The night's loss would be recorded in the official ledgers as more than £10,000. However, the true loss was not quantified in wasted tea or pounds sterling. It was based on loyalty, trust, and the flimsy delusion that Britain still had consent to control her colonies. Something deeper surfaced the night the tea sank. A universal, indisputable truth. The era of non-violent protest was coming to an end. Boston was prepared for the reckoning that was imminent. There was a quick and intense response when news of the Boston Tea Party made its way to London across the Atlantic. For British authorities, it was more than just a demonstration. It could not be disregarded. It was insurrection, an outspoken, derisive challenge to royal authority. It was reported that King George III became icy cold with rage after learning the news. Outrage erupted in Parliament, which was already irritated by years of colonial disobedience. They called for punishment not only for Boston, but also for other American colonies as a warning. The outcome was a set of laws so severe that they were soon dubbed America's Unacceptable Acts. The Boston Port Act dealt the first blow quickly. Parliament made the cruel decision to shut down Boston's busy harbor. The city's economic lifeline until the damaged tea was repaired and peace was restored. Ships were unable to enter or exit. Trade stopped. Supplies and goods dried up. Once lively and boisterous, Boston became still, its ports strangely silent. The penalty, however, did not end there. The Massachusetts Government Act firmly placed the colony under the authority of the king's nominated authorities and deprived it of its right to self-govern. The Administration of Justice Act made it possible for royal officials who were charged with crimes to stand trial in Britain, a strong indication that British officials were unassailable. Additionally, British soldiers were stationed all across Boston, residing among the exact people they were supposed to control to ensure the colonists understood that using force was an option. It was an obvious message. They would suppress rebellion. The Crown would no longer allow liberty as a luxury. However, the heavy hand of Parliament had an unexpected consequence. It infuriated the neighboring colonies rather than intimidating them into submission. Across America, news of Boston's suffering, its port shuttered, its citizens starving under martial law, sparked intense empathy and justifiable rage. From nearby colonies, wagon loads of food and supplies came into Boston. The formerly divided colonies started to come together through secret meetings, letters of encouragement, and promises of togetherness. What had started out as a Massachusetts issue was quickly spreading to the entire country. Britain had wanted to set an example by punishing Boston. Rather, they used Boston as a symbol and a call to action for resistance. Once smoldering in isolated areas, the flames of revolution now spread from colony to colony and were impossible to put out. Boston's punishment had a profound impact that extended well beyond Massachusetts' rugged coastline. Outrage became something much more perilous for Britain across the 13 colonies. Unity, the colonies divided by geography, religion, and trade, rivals, had been arguing and competing like distant cousins for years. Americans throughout the continent realized, however, that if it could happen to Boston, it could happen to anybody when Parliament closed Boston's harbor and deprived Massachusetts of its autonomy. The reaction was prompt from South Carolina to New Hampshire, from Virginia to Pennsylvania. Wagons loaded with food, supplies, and letters of support were sent by colonists to Boston's suffering citizens. Anger was in the air during town gatherings. To disseminate the news, newspaper printers worked around the clock. Boston was no longer alone in the fight. Everyone had it. Thus, an extraordinary event occurred in September 1774. Philadelphia hosted the first meeting of the Continental Congress. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies convened for the first time to discuss a coordinated response. Once only local leaders, men like George Washington, Patrick Henry, John Adams, and Samuel Adams now stood together as the masterminds of a movement that was becoming more and more widespread. Officially, at least, their objective was not yet complete independence. Beneath the courteous arguments and well-crafted petitions, a deeper understanding was beginning to take hold. Most still hoped for reconciliation, a return to the previous relationship of mutual respect under the British monarch. The colonies were no longer able to maintain their independence. They decided on a broad boycott of British products at the Congress. In the event that British aggressiveness increased, they promised to help one another. Additionally, they said unequivocally that any assault on one colony would be interpreted as an assault on all. Across the continent, common people started utilizing terms that were previously exclusively muttered in private in bars and meeting halls: liberty, solidarity, and resistance. Britain had hoped to suppress insurrection by putting the hammer down on Boston. Rather, it had fused the colonies into something much more perilous. Despite their differences, this group of people was starting to see themselves as Americans rather than dispersed provinces. No longer were the winds of revolution only stirring, they were assembling into a tempest. And Britain couldn't stop it in time. Not only boxes were destroyed the night the tea sunk into Boston Harbor. It was the false belief that the American colonies could continue to be obedient subjects indefinitely. No king, no army, and no far-off parliament could ever extinguish the flame that the Boston Tea Party ignited. That spark spread throughout the colonies in the months that followed. Boycotts, protests, and civil petitions turned into outright opposition. Storehouses were loaded with powder and shot as town militias started drilling in the open. Once toasting King George III in pubs, men now discussed revolt in the same establishments. Boston, beaten yet unflinching, came to represent sacrifice. The colonies slid out of Britain's grasp the more it attempted to tighten its hold. Every ship that passed Boston's shuttered, quiet harbor served as a subtle reminder that American resistance had defeated tyranny. The intolerable acts were passed by Parliament with the intention of scaring the other colonies into submission by using Boston as an example. Rather, they had produced a rallying cry, a martyr city. Colonists from Georgia to New Hampshire came to understand that their destiny was interconnected. Tea was no longer a factor in resistance. It was about freedom, identity, and survival. Outside of Boston, the tension escalated by the spring of 1775. British troops going to seize colonial guns in Lexington's villages discovered armed farmers, ordinary citizens prepared to defend their rights with musket fire. Instead, with a clear line traced back to the time when men threw a fortune's worth of tea into the harbor out of principle rather than profit, the first shots of the American Revolution rang out. The Boston Tea Party demonstrated to the world that banners and trumpets are not always used to herald revolution. A tiny handful of resolute individuals standing in the cold, choosing defiance over fear, might sometimes be the silent beginning of it. The colonists weren't merely fending off attackers when they dumped the tea. An empire was being rejected. And one thing had become evident that night in Boston Harbor, despite the fact that the road ahead would be unpleasant, brutal, and unpredictable. The American colonies had lost their status as obedient subjects. They were something fresh and perilous. They were revolutionaries, and they had only just begun. Corral existed before the soaring pyramids of Giza, before the vibrant civilizations of Mesopotamia, and before Stonehenge towered above the sky. Nearly 5,000 years ago, Corral rose in peaceful magnificence in the arid valleys of coastal Peru. Since then, it has faded into near total oblivion, engulfed by sands and forgotten by history. The world was unaware of its existence for centuries. At first appearance, the tremendous valley where Corral once flourished appears to be an improbable location for civilization to flourish. The area is dry and desolate, with the river hardly more than a slender silver thread slithering over dust and pebbles. It appeared hostile to most people, a place where life had left it. Nevertheless, one of the first big cities in human history emerged here, amidst the emptiness. Corral was more than just a makeshift trading post or a scattering of cottages. Pyramids, plazas, residential areas, and ceremonial areas were all part of this 150-acre planned city. It had vision, scale, and purpose. Centuries before the Egyptians started building their own pyramids, a sophisticated society was thriving. Without the wheel, written language, or metal tools, the Corral people accomplished this. They used just their creativity, teamwork, and the unadulterated strength of human will to construct enormous structures out of stone and soil. However, Corral's existence was kept a secret for thousands of years. Even when travelers happened upon the odd worn mounds dotted throughout the valley, they thought they were just hills formed by the desert winds. Nobody knew that one of the world's ancient towns was located beneath the sand, surpassing even the civilizations touted as the earliest in history books. The truth wasn't discovered until the late 20th century by archaeologists under Ruth Shady's direction. They discovered something that would change the history of the Americas and make everyone reevaluate their preconceived notions about the origins of civilization. In complete secrecy, Corral has risen, thrived, and fallen. Its stones are now speaking once more after millennia of quiet, talking of a peaceful, wise people who created a complex and amazing world in a place where life itself seemed impossible. And their story was only getting started. The Soup Valley initially appears to be a location where life should be difficult. Long areas of stone and sand are swept by harsh winds. The terrain is baked into fractured, brittle sheets as the sun ruthlessly dries up the ground. The river is a meandering thread, struggling to survive, and there is a shortage of water. It appears to the inexperienced eye to be a wasteland, empty, desolate, and neglected by the gods. However, the residents of Corral noticed a change. They saw no need to be afraid of a desert. They witnessed the shaping of a painting. Even though the river was small, they understood it to be the source of possibility. Thus, by perseverance, resourcefulness, and sheer willpower, they transformed this harsh environment into a flourishing haven of culture and life. Agriculture was their first triumph. By creating straightforward yet ingenious irrigation systems that distributed water around the valley floor, they were able to control the river's seasonal floods. They encouraged green shoots of optimism when others saw dust and sand. Sweet potatoes, guava, squash, beans, and cotton. Specifically, cotton turned to become their treasure. It was woven into textiles and fishing nets, fostering trade with coastal communities and forging ties that extended well beyond their desert homeland. However, their skill was not limited to cultivating crops. The residents of Corral realized that maintaining equilibrium was necessary for desert life. Instead of working against nature, they worked with it. They used stone and dirt to construct their houses and plazas, making them resistant to the intense heat and the infrequent, harsh rains that occasionally swept over the valley. With the accuracy of expert astronomers, they planned their harvests by studying the stars and seasons. Trade turned into Corral's economic lifeblood. Fruits, cotton, dried fish, and handcrafted items were transported up and down the coast. Corral got exotic things in return. Rare Andean stones, vibrant Pacific shells, and concepts from far-off peoples. They weren't alone. They had a connection. Through cunning, ingenuity, and camaraderie, Corral flourished in a place where survival seemed unattainable. They did not use force to take over the desert. Together, they developed a society that was more than merely utilitarian by learning its rhythms and appreciating its strength. It was remarkable. Despite all the challenges, Corral developed into a beacon of civilization that was only starting to rise. The pyramids of Corral defy our preconceived notions about early American civilization, rising out of the desert like ancient guardians. These weren't little rudimentary constructions made by uncivilized people. They were large, purposeful architectural creations made by a people with ambition, organization, and vision. The Pyramid Mare, the biggest of Corral's colossal constructions, served as the city's focal point. It towered almost 60 feet above the desert surface and was more than 450 feet long, an engineering achievement comparable to the ancient world's early wonders. The pyramid, which was constructed out of stone, mud, and woven reed sacks packed with rocks, was made to survive both the severe weather and the occasional earthquake that shook the area, and persevered for almost 5 millennia, remaining silent in the face of time and wind. However, the Corral pyramids weren't graves. The pyramids built by Corral had a different function than the enormous Egyptian tomb monuments. They served as hubs for public life, power, and ritual. Their tops were adorned with temples and meeting places that were reachable by wide, graceful stairs. These platforms used to have fires on top of them, and ceremonies were conducted under the unending Peruvian sky. Large, circular, sunken plazas appeared at the base of the pyramids, beckoning thousands of people to congregate for political gatherings, religious events, and public festivities. A society that valued order and togetherness, a people who were closely bonded to each other and to the universe, was implied by the very layout of Corral's cityscape. Smaller residential complexes that were probably inhabited by priests, bureaucrats, craftspeople, and farmers spread out around the pyramids. The pyramids themselves appear to have been positioned with purpose in accordance with sunrises, solstices, and star cycles. Architecture was more than merely useful to the residents of Corral. It was cosmic, mathematical, and spiritual. It's nearly hard to avoid experiencing a peculiar feeling of wonder when strolling among the worn stones now. These constructions were built without the use of metal tools, wheels, or beasts of burden, but they rose with scale, symmetry, and startling accuracy. Neither conflict nor vanity drove the construction of the enormous pyramids of Corral. They were constructed to unite humanity and eternity, the community and the universe, and the ground and the sky, as they continue to murmur a story that will never be forgotten over the sands. What distinguishes the ruins of Corral from so many other ancient civilizations is something very different. Beneath its sands, no weaponry have been discovered. Its plazas are not surrounded by defensive walls. No mass burials suggest internal conflict or brutal conquest. Corral was a community founded on peace, in contrast to the kingdoms that arose and collapsed by conflict, a revelation that goes against the grain. This was a society that thrived on collaboration, trade, and a common belief system rather than on warfare. The inhabitants of Corral appear to have focused their energies on architecture, astronomy, music, and social living rather than armies or fortifications. Their pyramids and plazas were not symbols of triumph against foes. They served as hubs for government, worship, and festivity. This civilization chose to congregate instead of subjugate, to engage in dialogue instead of annihilation. Carroll's success was based on trade. Coastal villages sold fishing nets made from cotton cultivated along the rich river banks. Carroll was compensated with exotic items from distant lands and dried fish, a vital source of protein. Unique tropical fruits from far-off valleys, priceless stones from the highlands, and vibrant Pacific shells. Corral flourished as a cultural and commercial center at the heart of this vast network of trade, which united the area and bound disparate people into a harmonious web of mutual benefit. Social concord was preserved in large part by religious and ceremonial life. The sunken plazas and other public areas of the city probably functioned as platforms for ceremonies that brought the populace together around common spiritual ideas. These events were loaded with music. Individual lives were connected to something bigger by the soundscapes created by drums crafted from deer hides and flutes cut from condor bones that reverberated around the desert. Additionally, leadership seemed to depend more on civic organization and spiritual authority than military might. Large-scale building projects, seasonal agricultural cycles, and intricate trade arrangements must have been organized by the city's officials, all without abandoning the terrible wounds of conflict. Corral serves as a bright spot in an ancient world that is so frequently characterized by strife, serving as a reminder that civilization does not have to emerge on the backs of the vanquished. Rather, it can be developed through the silent force of cooperation, imagination, and faith. The stone at Corral still seemed to pulse with the echoes of a world long since past. It was more than a city of commerce and structures. The city was a hive of ceremony, sound, and spiritual cadence. The core of Corral culture was infused with ritual and music. A wealth of ancient instruments, including flutes made from condor and pelican bones, whistles made from deer antlers, and miniature drums stretched with animal hides, were discovered by archaeologists meticulously searching through the dry sands. These relics weren't just toys, they were meticulously constructed, tuned to particular notes, and intended to transmit sound throughout the city's expansive plazas. Music was the soul's language in a world without written language. Think about it. As hundreds gathered beneath the waning light, there was the quiet hum of drums rising at twilight, flutes keening like the desert wind, and feet stamping on the sunken plazas. At the top of the pyramid platforms, fires would crackle. Priests would pray to the gods of the river, the soil, and the stars while wearing elaborately woven clothes. Corral was more than a metropolis in those days. A symphony was played. The design of Corral itself implies that ritual life was crucial to its existence. The great plazas were more than just open areas. They served as platforms for group rituals that were intentionally created to unite individuals. Like ancient amphitheaters, the underground circular courts directed sight and sound towards the ceremonies held in their middles, and the pyramids towered over them all, not as graveyards, but as human-made sacred mountains that connect the land and the sky. The seasons, planting and harvest cycles, and star movements were probably all signaled by rituals. Music was more than just amusement. It served as a link between humans, the natural and the supernatural, and the known and the unknown. No savage sacrifices, no frightful gods of battle, no violent murals. The spiritual realm in Corral appears to have been one of reverence, festivity, and harmony. You can practically hear the desert wind whistling through the remains today, ancient music's faint tones, the lost melodies of a people who, in the middle of the harsh, never-ending dunes, discovered connection, beauty, and significance. Carol was more than just a site for ritual, trade, and music. It was an engineering marvel that demonstrated human inventiveness in one of the world's most hostile environments. The inhabitants of Corral created a city of stone and dirt that has stood the test of time for almost 5,000 years without the use of metal tools, the wheel, or draft animals. Their accomplishments were astounding. Huge pyramids emerged from the desert floor. They were built using huge stones that were transported across the arid valley rather than tiny, brittle bricks. Workers used reed bags, clever baskets made from the very plants that grew along the riverbanks and sturdy enough to carry huge loads to carry pebbles. They carefully stacked stone and filled the interiors with rubble as they created layer after layer to create structures that would not only stand the test of time, but also the wrath of nature. They also had a good understanding of nature. Corral is located in an area that frequently experiences strong earthquakes. However, their plazas and pyramids were mostly unharmed. How? By being proficient in earthquake-resistant design. In order to enable their monuments to absorb and disperse seismic energy, builders employed layered infill, flexible building techniques, wide foundations, and rounded corners. It was engineering derived from a deep understanding of the earth itself rather than from textbooks. Another quiet victory was water management. The inhabitants of Corral created highly advanced irrigation systems in spite of their desert environment. Crops were able to thrive even during dry seasons thanks to the meticulous channeling and canaling of river water to their agricultural areas. There was no water waste. Every drop counted. Corral's design was a masterful example of urban planning. Significant features matched important astronomical positions, indicating a thorough comprehension of the solar cycles. With their exact geometry, the subterranean plazas served as more than just meeting spots. They served as tools for monitoring the heavens, which helped astronomers and priests forecast the seasons that were essential for survival. A complicated civilization was mentioned even by the city's organization. In order to balance communal life with sacred spaces, residential zones, administrative regions, and ceremonial centers were all organized harmoniously. They constructed for generations, not just for the present. Modern engineers are reminded that greatness is not just determined by technology, as they marvel at Corral's tenacity. Understanding the powers of nature and working with the earth rather than against it can sometimes yield the greatest insight. The stones of Corral have withstood earthquakes, hurricanes, and the passage of time. They serve as a silent reminder of a society that carved its aspirations into the arid landscape. Among the desert sands, the city of Corral thrived for centuries as a center of trade, music, peace, and architectural skill. Then, silently, almost imperceptibly, it was left behind. Its fall was unmarked by fires. Its walls bear no scars of conquest. A story of unexpected tragedy is not told by broken monuments or mass graves. Corral just faded instead. Its squares were deserted. Its pyramids were abandoned to the dunes. Time muted its drumming and flutes. For what reason did they depart? That question still haunts the Super Valley like a ghost. According to several academics, environmental change was the decisive factor. There is evidence that Corral's crops may have been severely damaged by a protracted drought. The fields would have died if it weren't for the river's nourishing waters. Trade networks that relied on excess grain and cotton would have failed. It's possible that Corral's meticulous equilibrium with its hostile surroundings has ultimately swung too far to the side. Other theories suggest that trade routes are changing. Corral's authority may have waned as other centers of power arose inland and along the coast, and as neighboring cultures expanded. Maybe their supply of cotton, seafood, and produce was insufficient to maintain their position as a major metropolis. The vitality of commerce gradually evaporated. Others hint at interior deterioration. Without written documents, we can only speculate about religious turmoil, political conflicts, or just plain weariness from decades of development. When survival becomes uncertain, even peaceful communities might break apart under stress. The departure appears to have been gradual rather than abrupt, regardless of the reason. Families probably left one by one in search of fresh starts, stronger rivers, and more fertile valleys. Behind them, kids who used to run over corrals' plazas grew up narrating tales of a vanished city. Tales that would become legends in time. Human constructions were recovered by the desert. Fine sand was spread across stone temples by winds. Buried amid shifting sands were flutes. A field of quiet, dormant mounds replaced what had once been a bustling, thriving civilization. Corral was concealed, a whisper under the dunes waiting for almost 4,000 years. The question remains as archaeologists meticulously unearth its stones today. How can a city that is so developed and exquisitely designed just disappear? Perhaps the reality is that even the most advanced civilizations, regardless of how smart or tranquil they may be, are merely strands in the fabric of time, constantly exposed to the invisible forces of change. Buried beneath the silent sands of the giant valley, Corral lay unnoticed for millennia. Unaware that beneath their feet lie the remnants of a civilization older than the Egyptian pyramids, travelers passed the odd rounded hills that speckled the area. They saw these as merely wind and time-sculpted mounds, natural phenomena. The last time the world heard Corral's voice was in the latter half of the 20th century. Curiosity and a growing suspicion that these hills might store mysteries no one had yet discovered inspired Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady to lead a team into the Soup Valley in the 1990s. The history of human civilization in the Americas would be altered by what they discovered. The sand was wiped away, layer by layer, with great care. It revealed a metropolis much older than anyone could have ever guessed, complete with pyramids, subterranean plazas, majestic stairs, and walls of meticulously cut stone. The unbelievable was confirmed by radiocarbon dating. Over 4,600 years old, Corral flourished at the same time as the first Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations. It was a finding that rocked archaeology to its core. Prior to Corral, academics thought that the vast empires of the Old World had eclipsed the development of civilization in the Americas, which occurred much later. Everything was altered by Corral. It demonstrated that long before the emergence of the Incas or the Mer, the Americas had independently produced complex urban life, massive building, and social organization. In addition to stone and debris, Ruth Shady and her team discovered musical instruments, fabrics, cue, fishing nets, old knot records, the remains of life, and even offerings sent to the gods. Every artifact narrated the tale of a people who had developed a society with foresight, wisdom, and extraordinary inventiveness. There was more to Corral's rediscovery than just academic success. It was a resurrection. The open sky once again unveiled a civilization that had been dormant under the desert for millions of years. The same winds that formerly carried the sounds of flutes and children's laughing kissed its plazas. As of right now, Corral is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a delicate, precious connection to the very first human aspirations of creation, community, and faith. Corral had been carefully concealed by the sands. Ultimately, though, the stones persisted, waiting for someone to notice, hear, or remember. As a silent giant, Corral serves as a reminder that civilization has much deeper roots than we previously thought. The old stones that modify our perception of humanity's journey speak among its pyramids and plazas. A tale of peace, resourcefulness, and optimism rather than conquest and violence. The people of Corral were creating something remarkable long before the imposing empires of Greece, Rome, or even Egypt. They did not use a wheel to raise pyramids. Without any written records, they plotted the stars. Without leaving the country scarred by conflict, they established a prosperous community based on engineering, music, trade, and ritual. Corral presents an alternative idea of what civilization can be in a time when conflict is frequently the defining feature. A culture that prioritized knowledge over dominance and connections over conquest. It serves as a reminder that violence is not necessary for complexity. Greatness is determined by how a community comes together to develop, create, and dream, not by the number of soldiers that march across a battlefield. Carroll's influence extends much beyond the Soup Valley's arid landscape. It questions long-held beliefs that urban life and monumental building originated in the ancient world and that civilization had a single cradle. Corral demonstrates how the inventive and aspirational spirit of humanity emerged independently in many parts of the world, molded by various hands but propelled by the same timeless aspirations to persevere, rejoice, and strive towards the divine. You can practically hear it today as you stroll around the worn ruins of Corral. The sound of drums beating, flutes humming softly, merchants haggling in the squares, and kids laughing as they run along stone lanes beneath an infinite starry sky. We still have their memories, dreams, and lives engraved in the earth's bones. Corral shows us that a civilization's soul may remain even after it collapses, waiting to inspire again, to be remembered, to sleep beneath the sands. In the vast scheme of human history, Corral stands out as both a symbol of the past and a lighthouse for the future, a reminder that the seeds of wonder, wisdom, and peace can sprout and create a world that aspires to the stars even in the most hostile deserts and beneath the thickest sands.